Act 1. History is a collection of things left behind. But what happens when the most famous woman in the world decides to leave nothing? Cleopatra VII wasn't just a pharaoh. She was a master of PR. She didn't just rule Egypt, she choreographed it. We know the burial sites of minor tax collectors and forgettable nobles, yet the woman who terrified Rome has effectively ghosted the last 2 millennia. Did she plan her own disappearance? Ancient Egypt treated tombs as branding campaigns. Cleopatra, who aligned herself with the goddess Isis, wouldn't have settled for a generic plot. Her absence is suspicious. It suggests a final act of defiance, a tomb designed to be found by the soul, but never by the conqueror. Whether her resting place is currently under a modern parking lot or guarded by the Mediterranean Sea, she remains the only queen who ruled by being seen and stayed powerful by becoming invisible. Act 2. When Octavian Augustus took Egypt, he didn't just want the land, he wanted the narrative. A grand tomb for Cleopatra was a political nightmare. Symbols outlive armies. If her tomb became a shrine, it would become a headquarters for rebellion. Rome's strategy wasn't loud destruction, it was a quiet exit. No dramatic fires, just a slow fade out from official records. Augustus ghosted her legacy. By sealing the tomb and restricting access, Rome turned a goddess into a footnote. But they forgot one thing. Mystery is more addictive than a monument. By trying to make her forgettable, they made her eternal. Act 3. If the sea didn't take her, perhaps the gods did. Archaeologists are currently obsessed with Taposiris Magna. It's the perfect on-brand location for her. Dedicated to Isis and Osiris, it sits far enough from the city to be discreet, but close enough to be symbolic. We found coins with her face and tunnels carved deep into the rock. These aren't storage units, they are secrets. But archaeology isn't like the movies. It's slow, expensive, and allergic to certainty. We are currently in a state of almost. And in history, almost is the most dangerous word there is. Act 4. While Cleopatra was manipulating symbols in Egypt, centuries later and thousands of miles away, men were fighting a different battle. The battle against hunger and the horizon. Enter the Chuckwagon. If Cleopatra's tomb was a miracle of symbolism, the Chuckwagon was a miracle of survival engineering. Long cattle drives didn't have menus. They had dust, heat, and thousands of animals that didn't care about your dinner plans. The cook, was the most powerful man on the trail. He held the coffee, the beans, and the sourdough starter. You could insult the trail boss, but you never insulted the man holding the skillet. The Chuckwagon wasn't just a kitchen, it was the spine of the American frontier. Act V. Let's talk about the menu. It was a lifestyle of repetition. Beans, biscuits, and coffee. Coffee so strong it could wake the dead, or at least the deeply resentful. This wasn't culinary art, it was fuel. It turned exhaustion into miles. The cookie had to be a doctor, a baker, and a meteorologist. He woke up at 3 a.m. in the freezing dark to coax a fire out of damp wood. He was the unsung hero who ensured that at the end of a 15-hour day, there was a hot plate waiting. It was monotonous, greasy, and sandy, and it was the best meal those men ever had. Act 6. Survival on the frontier required a wagon. Survival in Edo, Japan required silence. The Tokugawa shogunate created an information state. Peace was maintained not by trust, but by constant, polite observation. Travel was paperwork. Moving from one village to another required permits, checkpoints, and a very good excuse. Your neighbors weren't just friends. They were your mutual responsibility group. If you broke the law, they paid the price. This turned gossip into intelligence. In Edo, the most effective spies didn't wear masks. They were ordinary shopkeepers or innkeepers. Act 7. we end our journey in the great courts of the Caliphates. Here, power wasn't just gold, it was eloquence. A ruler's legitimacy was measured by the poets he kept. A well-crafted poem could travel further than a royal decree. Satire was the nuclear weapon of the 10th century. A single biting verse could destroy a reputation faster than a lost war. This was an economy of words. Musicians and poets navigated a world of high stakes, where a clever line brought a bag of gold, and a wrong word brought exile. From Cleopatra's missing tomb to the cowboy's bitter coffee and the caliph's rhythmic verses, history shows us one thing. Whether through stone, food, or poetry, we are all just trying to leave a mark before the dust settles. Act 8. For centuries, we've been told Cleopatra ended her life with the bite of an asp. But modern toxicologists and historians are skeptical. A snake bite is a messy, painful, and unpredictable way to die, hardly fitting for a woman who micromanaged every second of her public image. Many scholars now believe she may have used a toxic cocktail of hemlock, wolfsbane, and opium. This was a sophisticated pharmacological exit. By choosing a poison that mimicked a divine sleep, she ensured her body would remain pristine and goddess-like for the Romans to find. She didn't just commit suicide. She engineered a biological masterpiece that would keep us guessing for 2,000 years. Act 9. In Edo, Japan, the road was a weapon of the state. The sekisho or checkpoints were the physical manifestations of the shogun's paranoia. Guards were trained to look for two specific threats: outward women and inward guns. They feared that the wives of the daimyo, lords, would flee the capital, or that weapons would be smuggled in to start a coup. If your hair was styled incorrectly or your dialect didn't match your papers, you were detained. These gates weren't just for security, they were psychological barriers. They reminded every citizen, every second of their journey, that their freedom was a loan from the shogun, and it could be recalled at any moment. Act 10. On the American frontier, a cowboy's most precious possession wasn't his gun, it was his sourdough starter. This living ghost was a fermenting mix of flour and wild yeast that the cook, or cookie, had to keep alive at all costs. In the freezing winters, the cook would actually sleep with the jar inside his bedroll to keep the yeast warm enough to survive. If the starter died, the bread died, and the morale of the entire cattle drive died with it. Some of these starters were decades old, passed down from one wagon to another. It was a tangible link to home in a land that offered no comfort, a piece of the past feeding the future. Act 11. While the caliphs sat on thrones, the real soft power of the Islamic Golden Age lived in the voices of the Chiyin, highly educated female performers. These weren't just singers, they were the intellectual influencers of their time. They were expected to be masters of philosophy, mathematics, and complex poetry. A ruler's court was judged not by its soldiers, but by the refinement of its women's songs. They were the bridge between the political and the spiritual. Through a single melody, they could convince a caliph to show mercy or lead him toward a new philosophical discovery. They were the invisible architects of the court's soul. Act 12. Why are we so obsessed with what is missing? From the lost tomb of Alexandria to the forgotten recipes of the Trail and the silent halls of the caliphs, history isn't just about what we found. It's about the beauty of the search. Cleopatra, the cowboy, and the poet all understood that to be truly immortal, you have to leave a mystery behind. A found tomb is just a museum. A missing tomb is a legend. As we close this chapter, remember that the most powerful stories aren't written in stone. They are the ones that whisper to us from the shadows, daring us to keep looking. Because in the end, we don't find history, history finds us. Act 13. History is written by the victors, but Octavian, the man who would become Augustus Caesar, found that even a dead Cleopatra was harder to defeat than a living one. For 2 minutes, let's look at the psychological war that followed her suicide. Octavian had a problem. He needed to display her in a victory parade in Rome to prove his dominance. Instead, he had to parade an image of her with an ASP on her arm. This was the birth of a myth. Rome began an active campaign of damnatio memoriae, the erasure of her name from monuments. But the more they tried to bury her memory, the more they turned her into a martyr for the East. The missing tomb became a symbol of Roman failure. They could conquer her land, but they couldn't conquer her story. Every time a Roman official walked the streets of Alexandria, they felt the presence of her absence. This psychological shadow is likely why the tomb was eventually forgotten by official history. It was a wound that Rome didn't want to keep reopening. Act 14. On the American frontier, the Chuckwagon was more than a kitchen. It was a courtroom and a sanctuary. In a world where a man's life depended on the stranger riding next to him, the evening meal was the only thing holding the group together. The cookie, or the cook, enforced a strict code of conduct. You never approached the wagon from the windward side, because dust in the food was a hanging offense. You never took the last biscuit unless you were sure no one else was hungry. It was about survival. A cranky crew was a dangerous crew. If the coffee was cold or the beans were dry, tempers flared, and in the Wild West, a flared temper usually meant a drawn gun. The cook used food as a tool of diplomacy. He would save the best cuts of meat for the men who worked the hardest or the night guards who kept the herd safe. The Chuckwagon was the first true social contract of the West, a place where hierarchy faded and everyone was equal before the bean pot. Act 15. We often think of the Big Brother surveillance state as a modern invention of the digital age, but Edo period Japan was doing it 400 years ago with nothing but paper and ink. The Ganingumi, or 5 family groups, were essentially a human algorithm. Each person was responsible for the actions of 4 others. If your neighbor committed a crime and you didn't report it, you were just as guilty. Imagine a world without privacy, where your every purchase, your every visitor, and even your travel plans were noted by your community. This created a culture of extreme politeness that was actually a survival mechanism. You were polite because your life depended on your neighbor's opinion of you. This wasn't just spying. It was a social architecture designed to make rebellion impossible. It's a chilling reminder that human beings can be conditioned to watch each other more effectively than any camera or software ever could. Edo Japan didn't need a central database. It turned the entire population into a living, breathing hard drive of information. Act 16. In the golden age of the Caliphates, a musician wasn't just an entertainer, they were a scientist of sound. Let's talk about the oud, the ancestor of the guitar. In courts like Baghdad or Cordoba, music was taught alongside mathematics and astronomy. They believed that the strings of the oud corresponded to the 4 elements of the earth: fire, air, water, and earth. When a master musician played, they weren't just playing a song. They were attempting to bring the listener's body back into harmony with the universe. There were specific melodies designed to cure headaches, others to soothe grief, and some to sharpen the mind for battle. This was musical therapy a millennium before the term existed. A caliph who understood these makams, or musical modes, was seen as a ruler who understood the secret codes of creation. It adds a whole new layer to the courtly life. It wasn't just about luxury. It was about using beauty as a bridge to divine knowledge. To master the rhythm was to master the pulse of the empire itself. Act 17. As we look back at these 3 vastly different worlds, the lost sands of Egypt, the dusty trails of the West, and the melodic courts of the East, a single pattern emerges: the power of what is hidden. Cleopatra chose an invisible grave to stay eternal. The cowboy used a humble wagon to conquer a continent. The Japanese shogun used silence to maintain a centuries-long peace. We live in an age where everything is recorded, geotagged, and uploaded. We hate mysteries. We want to find the tomb. We want the GPS coordinates of history. But maybe the mystery is where the magic lives. If we found Cleopatra's body today, she would become a museum exhibit, a collection of bones and jewelry. But as long as she is missing, she is a queen of our imagination. These stories remind us that the most significant parts of the human experience aren't the things we build out of stone, but the legends we weave out of silence. History isn't just about what happened. It's about why we still care, thousands of years later, about a woman who vanished in a world that refused to be forgotten. Act 18. If Cleopatra's tomb is the ultimate prize, the sunken library is the ultimate tragedy. For 2 minutes, imagine the world's knowledge resting at the bottom of the harbor. When Alexandria's royal quarter slid into the sea due to centuries of earthquakes, it wasn't just gold that vanished, it was the data. Cleopatra was a polyglot. She was the only Ptolemaic ruler to speak Egyptian, and she frequented the Great Library. Archaeologists today aren't just looking for a sarcophagus, they are looking for the papyri of the palace. If her tomb is nearby, it likely contains the scrolls she cherished. We often view her through Roman eyes because her own records, her poetry, her medical texts, and her political letters are likely encased in the Mediterranean silt. Finding her tomb isn't just about finding a queen. It's about finding the lost voice of the ancient world that Rome tried so hard to drown. The sea isn't just a grave for a person, it's a vault for a civilization's mind. Act 19. The Chuckwagon had a secret compartment that no cowboy liked to talk about, the medicine chest. In a land with no hospitals and 1,000 ways to die, the cookie was your surgeon, your dentist, and your pharmacist. This 2-minute reality check reveals the grit behind the glamour. Inside that chest, you wouldn't find modern medicine. You'd find whiskey for pain, turpentine for wounds, and black draft for stomach trouble. If a horse kicked you or a rattlesnake bit you, the cook was the one who decided if you stayed in the saddle or stayed in the dirt. This highlights the immense pressure on the cook. He had to be a master of makeshift miracles. He used what he had: a hot iron to cauterize, sourdough starter to draw out infection, and strong coffee to fight exhaustion. The Chuckwagon was a mobile ER. When we talk about the Wild West, we forget that it was the contents of this small wooden box and the steady hands of a dusty cook that determined who made it to the railhead and who became a nameless cross on the trail. Act 20. While the checkpoints watched the commoners, a much deeper game was being played by the Onmitsu, the shogun's private investigators. For these 2 minutes, let's go behind the curtain of Edo's secret police. These weren't ninjas in black pajamas. They were accountants, gardeners, and low-ranking samurai who lived completely boring lives as a cover. Their job was the invisible war, the monitoring of the high-ranking daimyo. They looked for subtle signs of treason, a lord buying too much gunpowder, a secret marriage alliance between 2 powerful families, or a castle wall being built slightly too high. This surveillance created a culture of the unspoken. Everyone in power knew they were being watched, but no one knew by whom. It turned the halls of the shogun's palace into a chess match of paranoia. This era of peace wasn't accidental. It was manufactured through a complex network of shadows. The Onmitsu proved that the most powerful weapon in Japan wasn't the katana, but a well-timed report delivered in the middle of the night.